which we're celebrating the music of arguably America's greatest composer, Aaron Copland. We have, of course, many composers. Where would American music be without George Gershwin, the star of Broadway, who then made his name as a serious composer with American in Paris and Rhapsody in Blue? Charles Ives, the man who started it all, this Yankee maverick dilettante from upstate Connecticut, tinkering away in his basement at the very beginning of the 20th century. And then, of course, there was Leonard Bernstein, who somehow tied it all together. Composer, pianist, conductor, evangelist, the closest we've had to an American Mozart. But if there was a man, a kind of Old Testament prophet figure who, over the course of a very long and soberly lived life, managed to hold it all together, to be truly the kind of big man of American classical music during the glory days of the so-called Pax Americana, it was undoubtedly Aaron Copland. Not, it must be said, the virtuoso pianist or especially virtuoso conductor that his very dear friend, comrade, and pupil Leonard Bernstein would be, but truly as very competent in those fields, and arguably, again, our greatest composer who could tie all those strands, stylistically speaking, together. The various indigenous American musical traditions with the best of the traditions brought over from Europe. You may remember from our discussion of Aaron Copland's Third Symphony, arguably his greatest attempt at writing the symphonic equivalent of the great American novel in the American mid-20th century. You may have remembered that I was discussing Aaron Copland's colossal debt to the music and the musical education traditions of France, and most especially specifically his teacher, the great composer, conductor, and organist, and quite simply, along with, say, Clara Schumann and Fanny Mendelssohn, one of the greatest women in the history of classical music, Nadia Boulanger, who, being asked by no less than General Pershing to help establish a school for American musicians in Paris at the end of World War I, proceeded to be teacher, mentor, and guide to almost literally all of the great American composers, from Aaron Copland in 1920 all the way through to the great master of that style we call minimalism, Philip Glass. You may know the name. He wrote, amongst many famous works, that opera Einstein on the Beach. Philip Glass, very much still with us and living in New York in his early 80s. Boulanger taught and mentored everyone who was someone in American music. And if I'm going on a bit about her, it's because I'm thinking of her and her incredible tradition, most specifically when I think of the piece we're going to share together right now. Unquestionably, Aaron Copland's most famous, and I would say amongst his many, many great works, his very greatest work. A work that is great, like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is great. You've probably guessed it, I'm referring to his immortal ballet score called Appalachian Spring. And no, nobody calls it Appalachian Spring. Don't say that, it's pretentious. It's Appalachian Spring. And in that name, there's in itself a kind of a joke. Appalachian Spring was a ballet that was commissioned by a great, great philanthropist, one of the other great women of classical music, Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, a millionairess and philanthropist who, working with the Library of Congress in, of course, Washington, D.C., commissioned Aaron Copland soon after he had, barely after the ink was dry on his other most famous piece, his Fanfare for the Common Man, which you'll remember forms the thematic basis of the finale for that Symphony No. 3. Mrs. Coolidge commissioned from Copland what was determined in the contract to be an American ballet. And in writing this ballet, from the get-go, he collaborated with the woman, another extraordinary, one of the essential women of the arts in the 20th century, the genius dancer and choreographer, Martha Graham. Copland and Graham collaborated from the very beginning. In fact, the original title, I hate to burst your bubble here, but the original title of the ballet was not Appalachian Spring, but quite simply Ballet for Martha. It was in searching for a title that Copland and Graham were reminded of a beautiful poem by the great American early 20th century poet Hart Crane, who probably never saw Appalachia. He was a resident of a place called Brooklyn. But he wrote a beautiful poem in his most famous book of poems called The Bridge, as in the Brooklyn Bridge, in which he made reference to, oh, Appalachian Spring. And Copland, Aaron, and Martha loved the sound of that, so that became the title of the ballet. It has since then become fashionable amongst the chattering classes, who mainly display their wares on the American coasts, to imply that this ballet has nothing to do with the American experience. But that, alas, is also a myth. The story of the ballet is indeed there are 4 characters in the ballet. There is a young pioneer couple in the late 18th century, the very end of the 18th century, when Pennsylvania was quite literally the American frontier, building their house with their own bare hands in the wilds of Pennsylvania. And then there are 2 other characters. First, an older prairie woman who attempts to impart upon the fresh-faced and, as you can understand, rather naive young couple the benefits of her hard-won wisdom. And then later in the ballet, there is an itinerant preacher who tells them a sermon of judgment and fire and brimstone. And at the end of the ballet, our young pioneer couple are left alone, strong and sturdy in their newly built house. There are other, I don't want to say non-American, I don't like the sound of that word, but there are other more cosmopolitan influences that also must be shared when discussing this piece. First of all, the sets for the first performance in 1945 at the Library of Congress were designed by none other than Isamu Noguchi, the great Japanese-American architect and landscape designer. Noguchi's furniture is still in very high demand today, and the act of courage it took in the midst of the Second World War to, as part of the plan, commission the set from a great Japanese-American architect and designer in itself is a profoundly eloquent message. But the other, the last gesture of cosmopolitanism, well, I don't even want to use that word, it's just the beautiful genesis of this work is, again, I go back to Nadia Boulanger and I go back to France, to La Belle France, which has had such a profound relationship in the culture of the entire American century, the 20th century, whether it be music or literature or art, cooking, film. Paris is everywhere. And it is everywhere in this very American Appalachian Spring. As I mentioned, Copland was one of the innumerable important American composers and musicians. I hasten to add that my viola teacher, when I was a young man in New Haven, Connecticut, Frank Brief, the viola player and also conductor of the New Haven Symphony Orchestra, had also been a devoted student of Nadia Boulanger at the school at Fontainebleau, the chateau just outside of Paris. This influence is so important on Copland and all of these great and important musicians, whether it be people like Aaron Copland or Walter Piston or names who are unknown to us. It was in 1945, at almost the precise moment that Appalachian Spring was being premiered, that Copland was also organizing a festival, an intimate festival of chamber music and choral music at Harvard University to celebrate the centennial year of that great and often forgotten genius, quiet genius of late 19th century, early 20th century French music, the composer Gabriel Fauré, F-A-U-R-E. Those of you who are choral music aficionados, of course, know and love Fauré because of the Fauré Requiem, his beautiful Cantique de Jean Racine, his various short sacred choral pieces. Those of you who love orchestral music may know Fauré's indelible suite of incidental music for the play by Maeterlinck that he wrote called Pelléas and Mélisande. You may know that beautiful elegy for cello and orchestra. Fauré was never, and probably never will be, the household name that, say, Hector Berlioz is, the man who left us the Symphony Fantastique, or the generation after Fauré, the French Impressionists like Claude Debussy, and Fauré's own pupil, Maurice Ravel. But Fauré lived, like Aaron Copland, lived a very, very long life and cast a very, very wide net in his sphere of influence. Like Copland, he served as teacher and mentor to countless younger composers. And Copland, ever since he had been in Paris in the early 20s and had met Fauré, who was born in 1845, but lived all the way to 1924, Copland always felt he owed a debt to Fauré. And so again, in 1945, as victory in World War II is just on the horizon for the United States and the Allied forces, Copland, along with two colleagues and fellow former Nadia Boulanger pupils, Roy Harris and Walter Piston, that great Italian-American composer and teacher who was then beginning his lifelong tenured professorship in music at Harvard, with Nadia Boulanger, organized this quiet festival of a kind of a centenary festival of Gabriel Fauré. And if you listen to one of those most famous works by Fauré, and I think a little later in the alphabet, a few days from now, when we get to the letter F and thus Fauré, I think even though it's not a symphony, we must share his suite from Pelléas and Mélisande. If you listen to the very opening of Fauré's Pelléas and Mélisande, that it's a very smooth and short transition to the very opening of Copland's Appalachian Spring, those six simple notes. What I'm trying to convey here is it's the essence of what we think of as the American sound in classical music is really a French sound, a sound personified by no one more than Gabriel Fauré. It's this very clean and clear and lightly textured, very diatonic kind of sound. Everything is octaves. When you listen to Copland's Appalachian Spring, and you listen to those great bracing, open-spaced American, and they are American melodies. Just notice how everything is built out of fifths, octaves, and thirds. Open fifths, octaves, and thirds. Truly the most simple building blocks, the most simple, what we call diatonic building blocks of classical music. And Fauré is so central to that language of Copland, and most especially as exemplified here in his ballet Appalachian Spring. There is, it must be said in closing, one truly indigenously American tune, and you probably know about 3/4 of the way into the ballet, which is a work in its complete form of about 25 minutes, you do hear that beautiful, beautiful old Shaker hymn, "'Tis the Gift to be Simple," otherwise known as Simple Gifts, on which Copland spins this very straightforward but beautiful web of variations. And then we get, after that, to the finale, the close, in which our young pioneer couple feels strong and confident in their newly built house. Appalachian Spring has become a work so central to American classical music that for Copland, he had no choice but to produce not one or two, but 4 different versions of it. The first performance was written for merely an ensemble, a chamber ensemble, not even really a chamber orchestra, but an ensemble of 13 players. The piece became, rather like Beethoven's Fifth, so immediately popular that Artur Rodzinski, the conductor of the New York Philharmonic, soon after commissioned from Copland a full orchestra version of a suite from the full ballet. And by the early 1970s, there were 4, and there are still today. You can hire the score and parts yourself from Copland's publisher, no less than 4 different versions. There is the full ballet for 13 players, the full ballet for symphony orchestra, the suite for symphony orchestra, and the last of the 4 to be published, which has actually become a vehicle for chamber orchestras and young conductors everywhere, the version of the suite in its original instrumentation for 13 players. We're now going to hear and see a performance of the full complete version in its version for symphony orchestra with one of our great advocates for American music, for what is, on the one hand, a great ballet score, but I think, as you'll agree, truly also a kind of symphony in one movement, a choreographic symphony in one movement. Here with Leonard Slatkin conducting the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, one of our great Midwestern, one of our great American orchestras, the complete version of Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring.